Alright, so today I was supposed to put up my video with my next installment on my list for Game of Thrones characters, but you know what? Something happened that I gotta talk about first. In possibly the most wait, what's going on announcement that's happened since Star Wars got sold to Disney, apparently Netflix is in the process of developing a new series based on The Legend of Zelda. So this begs the big question, is it a good idea? Well, I suppose first it should be said that if we're going to continue to try and adapt video games to screen, this sort of approach, a web series or a TV show, is probably a better idea than a movie. One of the many problems that has come up repeatedly in terms of trying to adapt video games to movies is that most video games either have very little story, it's a very threadbare story, so they try and pad it out with extra stuff, or they just try and roll with almost no story and then it just doesn't work. Or the video game has such a dead story, there's no conceivable way to reasonably condense it down to 2 hours. Now, most of the video game movies that have actually gotten to screen sort of suffer from the first issue. Games with larger, more epic scale stories, for the most part, the studio seems to have been avoiding them up to this point. So I like the idea of doing it as a series, as a general proposition in terms of ways to try and tackle video game adaptations in the first place. Now, addressing The Legend of Zelda specifically, there's a couple of problems here. And honestly, the big problem here is Link. Now, Link is really sort of the last holdout in what used to be a very standard trope, and that is the silent protagonist. You know, when the game first came out, it was back on the original Nintendo, there was very little dialogue, even text dialogue in games, because you didn't want to take away from the game in order to make people read. And Link was just one of many silent protagonists. It was pretty much the standard in anything that was really trying to tell a story, which would be you would talk to NPCs who would communicate some information to you, but your actual response to any of that wouldn't be written, and it would just be left up to the players to think of what their character said, if they even wanted to put that amount of effort into it, which of course at the time gave to a greater sense of immersion. Now, once we got up to sort of the PS1, more the PS2, they started doing it right. When we started getting fully voiced characters, well, silent protagonists kind of went away. It's pretty much just Link at this point. And from an adaptation standpoint, that's kind of a problem, because they're going to have to take this character who, for however many iterations he's had, has never had a definitive voice. He's had certain personality traits, he's been done more cartoonishly, he's been done darker, but his actual voice has never been heard, not articulately. So as soon as they start assigning a personality and voice, they're going to tick off a percentage of the fans. Since he's been a silent protagonist so long, everyone has their preferred version of Link, but it's in their heads. We don't really know what the definitive version of Link is, but everyone thinks they do. And you gotta remember, we're dealing with a fan base who's gonna be screaming their heads off if they so much as dare to make Link right-handed. So I think dealing with Link himself is going to be a problem and something that needs to be tackled. But honestly, there's another bigger problem with this, and that is story. Zelda doesn't really have much of a story. It has a framework, but there's not much of an arc. I mean, Link has a generic hero's journey, but part of the problem with trying to adapt the series is it's not really a series. With only a couple of exceptions, every game has really just been the first game done again with maybe a slightly different gimmick, whether it's 3D graphics or some new gimmicky weapon or a new stylized look or whatever, but they've always rigidly stuck to the same structure and essentially the same plot every time. You know, Link has to save the land and the princess and protect the Triforce from the evil Ganon, so he goes to a dungeon where he has to solve some puzzles, and he finds some sort of magic tool which will very conveniently be the key for solving the puzzles within that dungeon, and possibly even the key for defeating the boss he will ultimately face at the end of this dungeon. Rinse and repeat until Triforce is saved and Ganon is dead. Now, on the one hand, that sounds good for a TV show because it's very episodic. You could do a dungeon an episode, but the problem is that's going to get real repetitious really fast. That might work on a television schedule where you air it, once a week and sort of space it out. You give people time to breathe and then you come back and do it again. When you do it Netflix and they load the entire season up at a go and you binge watch it, that's going to get real repetitive real quick, which means they're going to be tinkering with the story and plot quite a bit to make this actually have a notable structure and an overall arc as opposed to just a Dungeon of the Week issue. having to tinker with that story, they're gonna tick off fans, because despite the fact that it's an incredibly simplistic story and you'd think that would give you the freedom and the leeway to actually do something with it, I don't think there's anyone as unforgiving and as severely overreacting as video game fans right now. They do not like you messing with their stuff. And Zelda as a property is just kind of in a weird place, because it's really going to need a strong artistic hand and someone with the real strength of their convictions willing to graft new story, probably new characters, because the repeat characters that we've got, I mean, you need Zelda, Link, Ganon, but most of the other repeat characters, like say Tingle, I don't want to see that guy ever. So they're going to have to invent new characters as well, which is also going to tick off the fans. But this is going to need to be guided with somebody who is strong enough and confident enough to make these changes and to bring something new and different to the proceedings. But I don't know that Nintendo's actually going to allow that to happen, because again, remember, they pretty much gave the makers of the Super Mario Brother movie carte blanche to do whatever it was they wanted to do. And they did, and the result was a disaster. My inclination would be Nintendo would only be agreeing to this if they were allowed much stronger control over what was going on. But if they're gonna keep it closer to the source material, that's just going to invite all these weaknesses that I've talked about that just don't lend themselves to an adaptation. You need to have the freedom to change all these things, otherwise it's never gonna work. And I suppose the other thing is, how much money are they willing to spend on this? Because remember, this is a big fantasy world, and if they're willing to throw, say, Game of Thrones money behind it, it could really be epic and awesome. But if they're hedging their bets on the budget, this could really look like crap. Or it could be all green screen, or all just set in forests, because they don't have to build a forest. They can just stick elf ears on a guy and make him walk around it for a bit. So I'm not particularly optimistic about that. And I have a tendency to end up that way whenever these announcements come down the pike. Now, the more we learn, maybe I'll get into a better place with it. But right now, unless they're putting somebody with a strong artistic vision at the head of this thing, which right now we don't know if that's the case or not, and they're prepared to spend some serious money on it, again, we have no idea, I just don't see how this is gonna work out. But we'll see. I'll be keeping an eye on it. It'll be an interesting development, because if it does work, then we've got a new outlet that will possibly eventually get us some good or even great video game adaptations. On the other hand, if this thing happens and it stinks, well, that's sort of one more closed door. What are your thoughts on this? Aside from Zelda, what is a game that you think would make a great Netflix-style TV series? Speaking personally, I think this format would really work for God of War. But what do you think? Whatever it is, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Until next time, this council is adjourned.